Thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for putting the paper on the program. So this is joint work with Hanna Halaburda from NYU Stern and Zhiguo from Chicago booth. So this paper, the motivation of this paper is the observation of some recent development in blockchain technologies. So there are a lot of new blockchain applications that are inspired by the so-called Byzantine fault tolerance protocol. Right, some of the examples including Ethereum 2.0, which is the ongoing upgrade of Ethereum from a proof of work system to a proof of stake system, and other examples including, for example, Tendermint, which is the consensus protocol underlying a lot of different blockchain applications. The now defunct DM project, which is Facebook's attempt to create a Bitcoin, create a coin for itself, is also based on those Byzantine fault tolerance protocol. So although Facebook stopped this project due to economic reasons, but the underlying technology is still completely based on this BFT protocol. So we haven't told you about what this exactly the Byzantine fault tolerance protocol looked like, but the idea, I will give you more details later. But really the idea is the Byzantine fault tolerance protocol is a set of algorithms to help different computer systems to be in sync with each other. So it was actually a very old problem, originally developed in late 1970s by computer scientists that is applied to distributed databases. Traditionally, these BFD protocols are developed for like large corporations or large government entities to have their distributed databases talking to each other. So the difference now is that when people are trying to apply these protocols to blockchains, this change is in that it changes the trust environments consideration and the trust environment assumptions behind this. So the crucial difference is that in traditional distributed databases, because all those computers are controlled by one entity, right? So as long as you specify a set of communication protocols between those nodes, right? And then you can do a lot of theoretical derivations to prove that some nice properties will come out of this. Right? But when you apply that to the blockchain applications, because those entities that involved in blockchains are not necessarily under the control of the same entity, they may be independent entities with their own objectives. Right? So that basically puts the question about we actually also need to think about the incentives of those participants in those communication protocols. So what is to emphasize again, in those classic Byzantine fault tolerance protocols developed by computer scientists, it's a set of algorithms for distributed computers to communicate with each other. And the only assumption, the BFT assumption comes from the fact that it is assumed that some of the computer nodes may behave arbitrarily. So they're to reflect, for example, technical glitch. And the BFT protocol basically stipulates a whole set of honest strategies for non-Byzantine nodes to talk to each other. Right? So the idea is that we have a bunch of computer nodes, they talk to each other when we would like to have certain nice properties, which I'm going to give you more details later. And some of those may misbehave to reflect technical glitches, but the remaining ones are assumed to truthfully, honestly follow whatever the protocol designer has told them to do. Okay. And also because computer nodes talk to each other to make decisions, right? So whenever they make decisions, they have to rely on whatever the information they receive in those communication process. They don't necessarily have full information about all the other nodes information. So they have to use their local information to make inference about what informations that other nodes have and then make decisions accordingly. So what this paper does, right, now is trying to apply these traditional BFT protocol to the blockchain setting. So as I've mentioned earlier, what we need to do is to get away this honest assumption. Right? We cannot assume that those non-Byzantine nodes will necessarily follow honest strategies. we actually also need to assume that they are rational so that we explicitly consider their incentives in participating in the BFT protocol. And one innovation or like a major contribution of this paper is to provide a framework for us to understand what do we mean by Byzantine nodes. Right? In the computer science literature, Byzantine nodes are effectively used to model for computer nodes that just face technical glitch or being hacked, and so they behave arbitrarily. And in traditional BFT protocols, because we just specify the protocols for non-Byzantine nodes, right? So we don't actually need to think about how these non-Byzantine nodes think about these arbitrary behaviors of Byzantine nodes. But for in a case when computer nodes are being rational, and we have to they have a framework to model their Byzantine behaviors. So the way we model that is to have assume that rational nodes are ambiguity averse against the Byzantine strategies by those non-rational nodes. I'm going to give you more details later. Okay. So this is just a very high-level overview about what this paper is going to do. If things are still being a bit unclear to you, this is because we haven't actually give you details about how BFT protocols work. So what I'm going to do now is to set up a game, and within this game, we will have a more clear idea what do we exactly mean by this communication protocols, and what do we exactly mean by what does those BFT protocols tries to achieve, and then also we'll see that what does the introduction of rational behaviors in those BFT protocols actually how would it look like? Okay. So we are going to consider so throughout the paper, we're going to study the following so-called consensus game. Okay, it is a game among a measure of n computer nodes. So in the traditional BFT protocols, there's always assumed that there's a discrete number of computer nodes that would talk to each other and follow certain protocols to achieve desirable properties. For our paper, just for tractability, we are going to assume a measure of n computer nodes. So a lot of those BFT protocols now actually are applied to are applied to cases in which the number of computer nodes are very large. So this is kind of reasonable assumption to assume a continuum measure of n computer nodes. Okay. So the consensus game works as the following. So first of all, the nature will randomly select one node as the leader, and then, so for example, here this guy is denoted as a leader, and then all the other nodes will be denoted as so-called backup nodes. Okay. And what does the leader do? So the leader will first decide whether to send a message to other computer nodes, right? So this message, if we put this in a context of blockchain, you can think about this message is a new batch of transactions. Okay, so this leader can send all those messages to other nodes. Right? So this is going to be the first step. So once all these backups receive this message from the leader, they will decide whether they would like to forward this message to other backup nodes. Okay. So in this case, for example, this backup, when it receives message from the leader, he forwards his received message to all other backup nodes. Okay, and this backup may do the same thing and just send message to each other, and then the backup on the bottom is also going to send message to each other. Okay, so this is basically what we call a peer communication, right? The peer communication stage is basically forward the message you have received from the leader to your peer backups. And in all those BFT protocols, all messages sent will carry the sender's signature. So that means that if a backup did not receive a message from the leader, then it will not be able to forward messages because the backup does not have the capability to forge the digital signature of the leader. So once all these communication processes is done, then each node can decide on whether to commit to a message based on whatever information it has received during the communication process. Okay. So what does commit, how do we interpret this so-called commit decisions? So we can think as, for example, if you put it in the context of blockchain, we've mentioned that when you send a batch of transactions, right, when the leader sends a message, it's as if it's sending a batch of new transactions. And then the commitment of message, you can think about is like basically acknowledging this new batch of transactions, and then formally append your local ledger so to include this new batch of transactions. Right? So in other words, you think about the commit message is basically means that I think that the message is going to reach consensus, so I update my local blockchain to incorporate this information. So once I have committed to a certain message, I will not, basically that's where the word commit comes from, is that I will just no longer alter it. Okay, you can think about sometimes when we say commit a message, we sometimes also say the message is finalized. Okay, so this is like the simplest game that we can think about, which forms the backbone of all different Byzantine fault tolerance protocols. In practice, the Byzantine fault tolerance protocols can be more complicated than this. For example, there could be multiple rounds of peer communication. In our game, there's one round of peer communication. Right? You receive message, and then you decide on whether you forward this message to each other. In reality, that the applications, sometimes the peer communication may just go for multiple rounds, or this entire game may also be repeated. Okay, but so we are going to study the simplest, the basic element of this consensus protocol, and we're going to see how does the introduction of rational nodes is going to affect the outcome. Okay. So if in this case, for example, if all computer nodes commit to the message, then the message is basically, you can think about the message is now finalized and their consensus is going to be reached. Okay. All right. So this is kind of like all we have done so far is to kind of give you the details of the sequence of move of this game. And then we are going to formally define the game is by telling what are the nodes preferences or utilities, right? This is how we actually finish the description of the game. So as we mentioned that the key of those Byzantine different Byzantine fault tolerance protocols is that there exists a measure of f of so-called Byzantine nodes. Right? So we use f. So out of this a measure n of nodes, we assume there's a measure f. F you can think about is short for faulty. So there are f faulty nodes. So who may take arbitrary actions? What do we exactly mean? But by taking arbitrary actions, just means that, like for example, if the leader is Byzantine, the leader may not necessarily follow the protocol, so he may not send the message to all other nodes. Right. Also, in the peer communication step, if a backup is Byzantine, then even if it received message from the leader, it may choose not to send messages to each other. Okay. So so some of the messages, some of the nodes may be Byzantine, and the question with the problem and issue with those Byzantine fault tolerance protocols is always that we don't know who is actually a Byzantine, right? If we know for sure that one of the nodes is Byzantine, then the problem is very easy, right? We just get rid of these Byzantine nodes and let the remaining guys talk to each other, and so problem solved. So the difficulty with the Byzantine protocols is that we don't know who is Byzantine, but we still want them to follow a specific protocol so that the remaining ones may still be able to reach consensus among them. Okay. So other than this F measure of Byzantine nodes, the remaining ones are what we call the rational nodes, and they will maximize utilities given by the following table. Okay, so let's look at this table closely. Okay, so we know that every node after all these communication stages, they eventually will decide on whether to commit to the message they received, if they ever receive a message. Okay, so we define the so-called consensus on this particular message to be successful if almost all rational nodes commit to that message. Okay, so now think about it. If we single out a specific backup node, right? After all the peer communication, it may decide on whether to commit to the message or not. If it chooses to not commit to the message, then it will always get a payoff of 0. If it commits to a message, then its payoff depends on whether the message that it commits actually eventually reach a consensus. Okay? If the message reaches consensus, then there's going to be a reward to the node. But if the backup commit to a message, but that does not eventually reach consensus, then it will incur a cost, which we call -c. Right. So what is the kind of the interpretation of these R and the C, the reward and the penalty? So you can think about it is that if you commit to a message, then basically you are claiming that you think this message will eventually reach consensus. Okay? If you commit to a message that do reach consensus, then you are contributing to this consensus formation process. So the protocol will typically give you a reward in maintaining the consensus process. Right? But if you commit to a message that does not reach consensus, you look to outsiders or to at least to the protocol designers that you're actually disrupting the consensus protocol. So you may actually get penalized. Right? So in some of the proof of stake system, this process can be called as so-called slashing. Right? So we don't need to explicitly model that, but we just assume that, okay, if you commit to a message that does not eventually reach consensus, then you may actually be penalized. Okay. So given this payoff specification, then we can see that this entire game is going to be a dynamic game of imperfect information. The game is dynamic because there's multiple stages. So there's first this leader sending message stage, and then there's pure communication stage. And then afterward, there's going to be the commitment stage where each node may decide on whether they commit to the message or not. So it is about dynamic game. It is also a game of imperfect information because every node eventually will only know what information they receive from the leader and what information they receive from other backups, but they do not have a clear idea about what information that others have received. Okay. It is a game with a flavor of a coordination because you would like to commit to a message when others also commit to the message. Right? So, and it also has a flavor of a cheap talk because the payoff eventually decide on the commitment decisions of all nodes. So even though there is a pure communication stage before all those commitment decisions, they do not directly affect the payoffs to those nodes. And the solution concept to the game is going to be, this is also another innovation in this game, in this paper, is that we are going to use this standard perfect Bayesian equilibrium plus ambiguity aversion against Byzantine nodes. Okay. Just to be more specific, if we look at this expression here, right? If we forget about this forget about this min term, so think about this in traditional games. Sequential rationality requires that every node I maximize its expected utility, right, by choosing its own actions, given her belief about what other rational nodes are going to do. And of course, this belief can be conditioned on the information set that it has received. Right? So this is what a traditional game would look like. And when we accommodate that, some of the nodes may actually behave arbitrarily. And so then we have this ambiguity aversion so that every node's expected utility at a given information set is going to be the expected utility, and thinking about that, the Byzantine nodes may do what's worst for you, right? So we introduced this ambiguity version into this utility specification so that we can accommodate rational behaviors and Byzantine behaviors altogether. All right, so in the remaining time, what I'm going to do is just very quickly go over how the main result, one of the main results of our paper is that once we have set up this game, we'd like to characterize all symmetric equilibrium out of this game that we have specified. Okay. So think about what a candidate equilibrium could be from this game. A candidate symmetric equilibrium is a game in which, right, a rational leader sends a message to each backup with some endogenous probability P. This P is going to be eventually solved for the game. And also the rational backups are going to forward the messages to each other if they have ever received those messages with some probability Q. Okay? And this Q is also could be endogenously chosen out of this equilibrium. Okay? And finally, every backup will need to decide on whether they commit their message or not. Okay? So think about the information that a backup can receive at the commitment stage. So first of all, the one piece of information is whether they receive information from the message from the leader or not. Right? And the second is how many messages they have, how many forwarded messages they have received from their peer backups. Okay, so we need to specify the information set in which a backup will commit, and also the information set in which it will not. So now let me give you some quick overview about this proof logic. So the proof is going to be based on both Bayesian updating and iterated deletion of dominant strategies. So let's look at the inference problem. So here I draw a horizontal line which indicates the number of messages that a rational backup may receive. Okay. See that the maximum number of messages a rational backup can receive in any candidate equilibrium that we have specified earlier is going to be this number here. Why this number? Well, so think about the maximum number of messages that a backup can receive in this candidate equilibrium. So the leader may be Byzantine, so the leader may send messages to each other. Right. So, and out of them, n minus f are going to be rational nodes, and the rational nodes forward those messages with the probability q. Okay, and the f of measure of Byzantine nodes may also all forward messages. So the maximum number a backup may receive is going to be n minus f multiplied q plus f here. Okay. So if we make the inference about whether the first inference we can make is about whether the leader is Byzantine or not. So think about if the leader is rational, what is the number of messages that you can ever receive? If the leader is rational, then we claim that the number of messages you can receive is going to be lying within this interval here, right? The lower end of the interval is n minus f multiplied by pq. So this is the case in which the leader sends the messages to each other with a probability p, and n minus f of them will receive the message. Actually, n minus f multiplied by p of rational nodes rational backups are going to receive the message, and they're going to forward it with probability q. Right? So and then also their FP measure of Byzantine nodes may receive the message, and they may also forward it. So that's the maximum number that you can receive under the assumption of leader being rational. Okay, so that means that if you ever receive messages outside of the interval, then you can immediately infer that the leader is Byzantine. But if you receive messages within this interval, then there's a chance that the leader is rational, but you cannot tell for sure because a Byzantine node, a leader, may always mimic a rational leader. So this is the first part of it. So second is that given the number of messages that you have received, you can also make inference about other rational, number of messages that other rational nodes receive. So we make one claim is that Like, for example, if you get for a given level of messages that you receive, other rational nodes will always receive number of messages that is either f plus or f minus of the number of messages that you have received. Right? The reasoning is because in one extreme, all these Byzantine nodes forward the message to you, but do not forward messages to your rational peers. So in this case, the number of messages that you receive is going to be always going to be strictly is always going to be f measure more than what others receive, right? So others, the number of messages others can receive is just at most can be f numbers smaller than you. Right? Similar logic. In one extreme, the Byzantine nodes may not forward a single message to you, but always forward messages to other backups. So that's why other rational backups may receive at most f messages more than I do, more than you do, right? So this is why whenever you receive a particular message as a rational node, you can infer that, okay, others going to receive either f minus messages more or f messages less. There's one catch is that if the leader is rational, then the number of messages received is going to be in a smaller interval. But of course, at any region, you cannot really know for sure whether the leader is rational or not. So we can claim that whenever you're just like whatever number of messages received, it is going to be within this interval, and within this green area. Okay. All right. So now let me walk you through very quickly a iterated deletion of dominant strategies proof to show that we're going to claim that if you are a rational backup in this game, you may only commit to commit to a message if your number of messages that you received is within this blue interval. If you ever receive messages outside of the interval, right? Like in other words, if you know for sure that the leader is Byzantine, then you should always choose not to commit to this message. The idea is actually quite simple once it's stated. Okay? So first think about if you receive fewer than f number of messages. If you receive fewer than f number of messages, based on what we have said earlier, you know that because others may receive f messages fewer than you do. So there's always a chance that your rational peers receive 0 messages, right? If they never receive any messages, they have nothing to commit to. So you know that they will not commit to the message. If they do not commit to the message, what is your rational behavior? Well, you should choose also not to commit, right? Because if you commit, but others do not commit, then you will be commit to a message that eventually does not reach consensus and you will be penalized. Okay? So that means, because those backups are symmetric. So that means like any rational backup that receives fewer than f number of messages will not commit. So now we can just go one step further, right? If you receive 2f number of messages, then you know it's possible for others to receive fewer than f messages. So they will not commit as well. If they do not commit, if you know that there's a chance that they will not commit because you are ambiguity averse, you think about the worst chance case possibility, you will also choose not to commit. So this process can go on and on. So eventually, we'll see that, okay, whenever you receive messages that is outside of this interval, you will not commit, okay? So what about if you receive messages that is within this blue interval, right? Should you commit or not? So we're going to make a claim that if you ever commit for at any point within this interval, okay, then you should commit at all intervals, right? Why? This is because suppose that, like we can prove by contradiction, right? Suppose that, okay, you commit if you receive this green level of messages, but you do not commit at this red level of messages, right? So and then because like when you receive this green level of messages, you know that because you know that other rational backups, they're the number of messages they receive maybe f plus or f minus, right? At most f plus or at most f minus from what you have received. So you know that there's a chance that all other rational backups receive messages that is somewhere here. And in this case, they will not commit by assumption. And then that means that it's going to be a bad decision for you to commit here too. So that means that if you ever commit in any interval here, then you should also commit at all points within this interval. Right? So, and of course, whether you truly actually commit or not, right? Whether you choose to never commit or you choose to commit in all those intervals here will depend on whether how large is the reward and the penalty, and which is going to affect your inference about the likelihood of the leader being Byzantine and rational. Okay. All right. So just to in summary, right? So we said we would like to characterize all symmetric equilibrium. Wrap up in a few minutes. Okay. Yes. Great. So yes. Good. So we have first a non-consensus equilibrium. This is a case in which you just never commit, as we mentioned earlier. Right? So there's also two equilibrium in which you do choose to commit within this interval. Okay? And there are conditions for these various different equilibriums to exist. Okay, and we see that the conditions are always just acquiring that the reward to be adequately high compared to the penalty. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to skip some of the derivations here, and I'm going to just go direct. I'm going to just finish up with some implications. Okay, so the implication is that what our paper does is we introduce rational behaviors into these Byzantine protocols, and then we see that equilibrium. There's always going to be equilibrium multiplicity in these consensus protocols whenever we introduce rational behaviors. In particular, there always exist those so-called non-consensus equilibrium, right? So this is kind of similar to this Babylon equilibrium in a cheap talk game. So that means that it's always possible when leaders are rational, it's always possible for system to get stuck. Okay, even if we focus on the good equilibrium, we also need to, for a protocol designer, it's also important to choose the reward and the penalties, and especially choose the reward not too low to ensure that the existence of those so-called consensus equilibrium. Okay, I think I will stop here, and I look forward to Matthieu's discussion. Right, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. So could you stop sharing the slide, and we can let the discussant to share his slide. So the discussant is Matthieu Bouvard from Toulouse School of Economics, and we look forward to your discussion.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay, so thanks a lot for this invitation. I mean, it's a paper I've been wanting to read for a very long time, so that gave me the final push. And so I think it's a real fantastic paper because I think there's many things to like. Well, first, the way the problem is set up, the results that the authors get, but also the fact I think it raises also many other interesting questions. So let me try to go through. First, trying to some extent, I mean, Jiasun did a very good job at motivating the paper, but let me try to do it again, just to reinforce why I think this is a very important way to think about these protocols. So essentially, I think the way I understand the problem would be something like this, right? So you have a leader, so that leader could be randomly selected in some fashion. And then the problem is that this leader is going to receive some information. So I think the easiest way to make this a bit more concrete is think about this is a blockchain, and then what we're trying to keep track of is transactions. Okay, so there's a new transaction coming in, and the problem is we want to make sure that this new transaction is recorded not just by this leader, but also by all these backup nodes. Okay. So you could think, okay, so like it's an easy way to do this, which is going to let the leader communicate, so send forward that transaction to all these backup nodes. They're going to record these transactions as well, and that will be it, right? So this transaction, which was initially with the leader, is going to be recorded everywhere in the network. Okay. Of course, the fact that this transaction is recorded everywhere in the network is critical, right? That's what we call consensus. We want that at any point in time, every node in the network has the same view of the history of transactions, and therefore, ownership, if you think this is, for instance, recording cryptocurrency transactions. Okay, so what's the problem with this? So the problem with this, what I call here kind of centralized communication, is what happens is if the leader is not behaving, right? So it could be because he has some ulterior motive. It could also be because it's just malfunctioning, right? There's some kind of glitch or something. Okay, so there you can easily see how this is going to break this consensus, right? Because the leader is going to potentially here send the same message, but only to a subset of those nodes. And so if these backup nodes, they behave kind of naively, so they just follow this idea, this rule that anytime they receive a transaction from the leader, they record it. Now we're in a bad situation, right? Because we have two backup nodes that have the transaction recorded, but then the other ones don't. Okay, so we've lost consensus. And again, that could be very problematic because it essentially means that this backup node and this one, they don't have the same view of that ledger. So ownership, for instance, is not going to be very well defined in this network. Okay, so could we do better than this? Yeah, we could, right? So we could say, okay, so there's a way to avoid this. And the way to avoid this is to let these backup nodes also communicate among each other, right? So here I've just picked up one very, again, arbitrary communication rule, but that would go around this particular problem because now, if each backup forward the message to another backup, right? So then this message is going to go all the way to these two backup nodes at the top. Even though they didn't get the message from the leader, eventually they're going to be able to record this transaction, and then we're back to consensus, okay? But then the last stage, the last reason why this might not work is, well, it could very well be that not only this leader has a problem, is a Byzantine, but also it could be that this backup node also doesn't behave. And what this backup node could do, it potentially could cut that channel of communication. And then we're back to a situation where you don't have consensus again, okay? And so essentially what the authors are saying is to say, well, so this is something which, first of all, has the flavor of a coordination problem. In fact, it's a coordination problem. Consensus by definition is about coordinating, okay? But it's a very complicated coordination problem because, first of all, there's dispersed information. So it's not the case that we all observe the same things. So if you look here, for instance, this backup node receives just one message from the leader. This one receives two messages from the leader and from another backup node. This one receives just one message from another backup. This one doesn't receive any message, right? So they're trying to coordinate, but they don't have the same view of the world. And that happens for endogenous reasons, which is the fact that nodes can choose to communicate or not. So the idea is, if you really want to think meaningfully about this coordination problem, and again, I want to highlight that this is not an easy problem, it's a difficult problem. You need to think about incentives, right? It cannot be the case that you just ask these nodes to blindly follow some rule. They're going to have to think about, do they want to coordinate? Do they want to commit? What kind of actions do they want to take, depending on the information they receive? And for this problem to be meaningful, it has to be that we think about their own incentives. And this is where, in economics, we have some tools to think about these coordination problems. And some of what actually Jason showed you today has a flavor of things we've done, for instance, with global games, with this iterative deletion of community strategies, even though here the mechanism is a bit different from global games. Okay, so let me just ask a few questions. Again, this is more like, I think, questions which are opened by this paper rather than questions that should necessarily be answered in this paper. The first remark is that, so the way this payoffs are set up, so at the end of the day, you have to make a choice. It's a pure coordination game, right? So the message itself is not very important. Again, if you make it a bit more concrete, you think about this as being, this is about validating transactions. You would think that nodes care not only about coordinating, but they also care about the message itself, okay? I don't think this is a big issue. You could just say, okay, we're actually focusing on the case where, there's no ambiguity about the fact that this transaction is valid. For instance, it's not clear double spending or clear, invalid signature. But I mean, I think perhaps like discuss a little bit, why do we think that the message itself is not important? Question that this opens, of course, and again, I don't think this is for this paper to answer, but clearly, I mean, these payoffs are going to be very important, and the question of where they come from is going to be key, right? So, should we think about this payoff as being like explicit payoffs, a little bit like block rewards in proof of work? Or do we think about this as, so those nodes have some kind of vested incentives in seeing this particular protocol functioning correctly? I think one thing this paper highlights is that, these payoffs are going to be very key. And one thing where I think then another avenue which is interesting would be interesting to explore is to what extent we think these payoffs are observable. Right, so here it's very important that we know what the payoffs are for these rational nodes. And of course, I think in practice, it might not be as straightforward. Again, if we think about, we make an analogy with global games. In global games, we know the payoff is not exactly known, typically the coordination payoff, and that plays an important role in coordination. And so that's one way in which this paper could, well, maybe not this paper, but like the following papers could go. It's also, I mean, the way you separate very clearly that these Byzantine nodes from these rational nodes. In practice, it might not be as clear, right? So you could think of these Byzantine nodes as having, for instance, a weaker preference for coordination. That's why they behave differently. The other thing I wanted to highlight is this: the assumption that nodes are so the rational nodes are ambiguity averse. Okay, so I like this assumption a lot because anytime we have these problems where there's an attacker, quote unquote, someone who could disrupt the systems, it's always very tricky to think about what's the payoff from disrupting. And so it ends up to being always arbitrary and in a way which I don't find really satisfying. And here, you don't really have to think about what's the payoff of these Byzantine nodes. You just have to think about what's the worst thing they could do to these rational nodes. I think that's a very clever way to go around this problem, which I find very convincing. The one thing I would highlight, so the one way which maybe this is, there's a form of an extreme assumption here, is so in the way you construct, so for instance, the way you show that if I know that the leader is a Byzantine, then I'm going to put my belief essentially of there's a possibility that there's not going to be consensus, is because I focus on that particular possibility. I'm never going to be willing to commit. That relies on these very specific strategies for Byzantine nodes that you develop, and it seems to me these strategies are very specific to that particular node, which is in that position. And so given that there are many nodes, there's a bit of this idea of, so when I say paranoid, it's a bit extreme, but it's really saying, okay, I'm basing my decision on a strategy where I'm going to be specifically targeted by the leader, even though, there's actually infinitely many of us, sorry. Okay, so that's one thing where, it's, I guess the downside of using ambiguity aversion is that you don't really care about, how likely is it that the leader is going to develop this particular strategy. I think I'm almost out of time, and so let me just say one more thing about the definition of consensus in the paper. So it's defined as the fact that all these rational nodes agree. And that's perhaps one part which I have a bit of a hard time mapping into the way I think at least about these Byzantine fault-tolerant protocols, which is, this is, it's not even clear we would know which nodes are Byzantines, which nodes are rational, right? And so if that's the case, how would we even know that we've reached consensus, right? To some extent, for payoffs to be well defined, it has to be the case that exposed, at least we can say, okay, so the consensus was reached or was not reached. And if you don't exactly know who's rational and who's not rational, and your definition of consensus is that all rational nodes agree, it's not completely clear to me how you would, specify this in practice. So that's one part where at least it wasn't, the mapping between what you do and the practice seemed to be, maybe there's a bit of a gap. Maybe there's you have an interpretation for that. I had more stuff, but I think I'm being too long. So let me just conclude by saying, again, I want to highlight how neat this formalization of this BFT protocol is, given how complex it is. I think that's a real tour de force. I think there's really a key insight in there on the role of dispersed information and consensus in distributed systems. I didn't have time to go through, how, so the conditions that Jiasun mentioned in the end about why is the unitary P equilibrium different from the fractional P equilibrium. There's a lot of interesting things there. And finally, the last thing I'll say is that, as someone who's interested, generally speaking, in coordination problems, it seems to me that there's a contribution there, which is not just about BFT protocols, but more generally about how to think about coordination problems when players are ambiguity averse, which is I don't think is something I've seen before. So, so again, well done, and I really enjoyed reading the paper.
Thank you. Jiasun, do you want to respond to Professor Bu's comments there in 1 or 2 minutes?
I think you're muted, Jiasun.
Jiasun, so you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So just first, I want to thank Matthieu for this great discussion. Matthieu has discussed many of my papers, and every discussion has been great. Thank you so much. I don't know whether we have time for questions. So I think I agree. All the points are well taken, and these are the things that we are actually thinking about. So I think maybe we can take questions, and if there are no questions, I may also just choose to respond a couple of points, given the time. Would that work?
I think you can. Do you want to spend 1 or 2 minutes to respond to his comments from Professor Bouvard?
Yeah, sure. So, okay, great. Yeah, so I'll just respond a couple of points. So all points well taken. So the first question is about invalid transactions. So yes, so the way, there's a good point. So we should make it more clear in the paper. The way we think about invalid transactions is that, so in the model, we have whether you send a message or not. And so we can think about if you send an invalid message, for example, like if you send a batch of transactions with the wrong signatures, it will be interpreted as not receiving the message. And so it's like when, for example, in Bitcoin, right? So as long as you receive a set of transactions with the correct signatures and also with the correct input and output, then you will accept them. And there's no particular assumption about whether like including a certain number of transactions or not including a certain number of transactions is going to be valid or not. So where do the payoff come from? So yeah, we should make that more explicit in the paper, because I think when we're writing the paper, we have always been thinking from multiple different directions. But I think we converge on eventually is that these payoffs and penalties should be some parameters that the protocol designers chooses, because you can think about this reward is so in Bitcoin, like whoever builds the new block gets all the block reward. So in this, so like mapping into our model, it's like the leader will, if the consensus is reached, the leader gets all the reward, but a backup doesn't really get anything. Right? But in a lot of those proof of stake systems, actually all the validators, they will get some reward, and the amount of the reward levels is actually a choice of the protocol designer. And in terms of the cost of C, I think it is going to be basically, so for example, in proof of stake systems, you have to put some money as collateral to participate in this consensus formation process. So if you misbehave, for example, if you commit to a message that eventually does not reach consensus, that means that you are basically you will look to outsiders that you're disrupting the consensus, then you will get penalized by having some of your collateral being slashed. So in short, we think these are more kind of design parameters that the designer would choose, and also our results have some implications on how, as a protocol designer, how you choose these parameters. About the payoff observability, yes. So if we interpret this reward and the penalties as what the protocol designer chooses, then that will basically automatically answer these observability questions. But again, we should make this more clear in this question. What's that? Give reasoning to Byzantine. Expose how do we define consensus? Yeah, this is a good question. I think we should think more about this, and I don't have a good answer on top of my head right now. And so in practice, how we determine whether a consensus is reached is basically by an outside client. But for example, when a client reach out to the when a client interact with a distributed database, it typically will sample many different computer nodes. If they all have, if an adequate number of nodes will give this unique and consistent information, then consensus is reached. But I agree that there is a gap between how this can be determined and how this work in our model. So this is something great, a suggestion. So we just also think harder about how to interpret this result. And finally, yeah, thanks for your suggestion about this is a bigger contribution to coordination with ambiguity version other than BFT. We need to think about what is the kind of another application of a coordination with the ambiguity version. If there's any suggestion on like what would be another application in which this is kind of a natural setup, I think that would be great. So far, of course, the BFT, of course, is the first thing that we come up with. But I think, yeah, but I agree. Just from a purely theoretical level, these results doesn't have to be confined to BFT. So
thank you, Jiasun.
Yes,
thank you. I'm
okay,
sorry to
anyway,
stop you there.
Just want to thank Matthieu again.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this discussion.